Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chaiyya Chats. My name is Ruben Thomas, and I'm joined today by Subdeacon Alexander Hatcher, also known as Pradeep Shamashin. Shamashin, thank you for coming on with us today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. For those who don't know, Shamashin is a graduate of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in New York, and he currently lives in New York with his family, and we're very thankful to have him here. So what we want to talk about today is understanding tragedy, the right response to it perhaps when we face it in our lives, and what is it, maybe the church's teaching of how that goes. And this, I think the reason we came up with this idea, or the reason Shamashin suggested this idea was most recently we all know about the passing of Kobe Bryant, a global superstar, celebrity. Him, his daughter, and 7 other people were killed in a helicopter crash recently. And a lot of people, especially the youth, had a very strong emotional reaction to it because of how connected they were to sports and to Kobe. And in light of those tragedies, and whatever tragedies we have going on in the world, whether it's personal deaths or any other conflicts that we have, I think we always find a way to ask questions about it and feel certain ways about it. So that's what we wanted to talk about today. So Shamashin, I know this is something you see in your ministry a lot. So if you mind just going into your experience about what you see especially from the youth in college day.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, this was something that, I'd kind of came to my mind, especially because of, the really tragic, passing of Kobe Bryant's daughter and those other people on that helicopter in California. But it's been really kind of at the front of my mind for a good couple of years, because of a lot of things that have happened in the Malayalam community, specifically as well. Recently, we had that, kind of the brutal murder and rape and murder of that girl Ruthie George in Chicago.
That's right. Yeah.
Here in the New York community, there were a couple of suicides in recent years amongst the youth. Things like that, tragic losses of kids of young ages. So what happens is, of course, this is so tragic, but the responses of people to those who are going through the tragedy or suffering the loss can sometimes be not just maybe unhelpful or kind of making things worse, but it actually is against our teaching on how God is in control and how what he's doing and not doing, and predestination. Really, it covers that. And it's not because people are trying to be horrible. They're trying to be comforting, and they're trying to look at the positive side of things. So I totally understand that.
Right.
But unfortunately, I think because of maybe how we're influenced by pop culture and maybe movies or other denominations of Christianity even, we kind of approach a death, right? And we kind of say things like, well, God has a plan, and God's in control, and it was his time to go, or his or her time to go, or... right? Who are we to question God, kind of thing. I've heard that as well.
Sure.
First off, just as a recommendation, when we're dealing with someone going through a tragedy, I would strongly suggest never to say something like, God's in control. Who are we to question God, or God's in control? I know of someone that even posted on social media that had gone through this loss. I'm tired of hearing people say God has a plan. Mm-hmm. And again, I know people are trying to be compassionate and, again, looking at the positive, so that's a good thing. But when we say things like that, we're actually saying that people are predestined. So we're saying that basically, okay, so this kid committed suicide, right? And I heard at the funeral people saying the same thing. Well, God has a plan, we don't know what it is, we just have to deal with it. So as if God was the one who forced this person to commit suicide. That doesn't make sense, because the church teaching is that suicide is tragic and is to be avoided.
Right. So you're saying that when people say God has a plan, there's no way that we can go against that plan when we say stuff like
kind of, this death was supposed to happen.
It was supposed to happen
in this way.
Right.
Like as if God is saying at this hour of this day you're gonna die. Like, have you ever seen the movie? I'm forgetting it now. It's an old movie from the 90s. But anyway, it was just predetermined. You couldn't escape it. That's how you're gonna die. Right. And so it's like God is sort of a puppet master, determining, I want you to die this way, this way, this way, this way. Mm-hmm. So yes, of course God is in control, and you believe in God's providence, and overall, God is guiding things. But in terms of specifics, we can't always say that, this is God making this happen and it had to be this way. Because if we say those things, then we don't have free will. And that is fundamental to Christianity, right? That we have free will. Because all of this goes back to the first epistle of John, chapter 4, God is love, right? And so we base why he gave us free will because he loves us perfectly. So we have total freedom to live how we want, to choose him or reject him, to love him or not, even to believe in him or not. Because if we weren't free, it wouldn't be love, right? It would be forced on us. Mm-hmm. That ties into free will predestination, right? So if we're predestined, if nothing we really do matters in the end, if we're predestined, if it's already determined what's going to happen in our life and what we're going to do, then we're not really free. And that union with God is not one of love. And so then everything that we've been revealed by God himself, that he is love, right? And revealed through the church that we have free will, would be wrong, would be a lie, right?
Right.
So I wanted to look at the scriptures and point out a couple different things and then talk about, what we do believe and how we can talk about these things.
Before you look at the scripture, you know how you said, like, when we have free will, right? We have that choice whether to love God or not. And that doesn't mean that there is a plan that we can't understand. But like you said, these tragedies that happen, they never chose, what happened to them. Right. And I think that's probably why people react that way, is because, in their minds, they didn't deserve this. Right. For people who are, that we might think deserve this, quote unquote, deserve what happens to them, we don't really question it. Right. But for these people, especially in our own community, we think they haven't done anything like that deserves this, right? And
that's key, what you said there, like they didn't deserve it. And that's sort of the tragedy of the human condition, right? That good people die, bad things happen to good people, and injustice happens, and death is the ultimate tragedy. And we have to remember that when we're talking about this too, because God is not okay with human beings dying this unnatural death through which we are completely separated from him and cut off from life. That's why Christ came. So we have to remember that. So if we think that God is using these horrible tragedies, like someone murder and rape, well, God has a plan and he planned that. Or this horrible helicopter death, and a father and his daughter go down together in the prime of their lives. We have to remember that, yes, God is watching over creation and he intercedes in creation. Of course, Christ came. But there is also a natural universe, a natural or law that he created, that he set up. And some things happen randomly. So I'm not saying we're deists. If you remember your U.S. history classes, remember Thomas Jefferson, he was a deist, right? That's basically the belief that God created the world and walked away. We don't believe that. We don't believe, obviously, God walked away, right? We do believe that he intercedes in the world, in mysterious ways we don't often see. We can say, where's God? Why isn't he making things better? We don't know all the things that he's doing because we're human beings. I would argue that if God wasn't intervening in the world always, we wouldn't be around, right? How could the world, as broken as it is and with all the evil and things that happen, how would it still be here if God wasn't holding it up? Of course.
Right.
And God does intercede and has things planned, but he'll never act in a way that takes away our free will. So we still have a response to his plan. So God has a plan for my life, okay. But it's up to us to respond to it. Just like it's up to us to respond to his hand is reaching out to us. He wants to be in a loving union with us, with humanity, with all of creation. It's up to us to respond and say yes. He'll never force his love on us, right?
Right.
So, people say, I want to make sure that at any moment I'm following God's will for my life. You can screw it up. Right? God's saying, I want you to go in this direction, but you can screw it up, right? He came to, the angel Gabriel came to Mary and said, and said to her, you will bear and conceive a son. And she said, yes, let it be as the Lord wills. Behold your handmaid, right? Even Christ shows us this in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? That the human response to God, the human cooperation with God is fundamental. Because again, goes back to God is love. He's never going to force this on us. is for us to freely choose. So Christ in the garden says, not as I will, but you will, right? Take this away from me, but not as I will, as you will. So our struggle is to try to at all times conform our will to his will. Like, I want to follow your plan. I might screw it up, but I want to follow it, right?
Right.
So, but that's real. That choice is real. Again, if we're predestined, or if we have, if we're subject only to fate, right? We don't have any freedom, and nothing we choose ever matters. We don't believe that as Orthodox Christians. So, in terms of a death, there's one that happened years ago, and someone who was a servant of the church, an amazing person by all accounts, died in a car accident. Very young, with many children, and a lot of people were just thinking, why? Why? He would have been such a great servant of the church.
Right.
Not an Indian Orthodox church, by the way, another Orthodox church. What happened? I remember talking to a friend of mine, and he was saying, we try to say that, well, that's what God had decided, that he would die at this time. So we just have to somehow be okay with that. And again, we don't presume to know what God is doing and not doing, what his will is in these minutiae, in the minute details, but he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, right? And so my friend was saying, isn't that just physics? And this friend was a strong believer, right? But we have to stop, I think, thinking of every situation as God is making that happen, because that's predestination. We have free will, and the way that we interact with the universe and its natural laws and orders and things just happen and interact, and there's actions and equal and opposite reactions and things like that, and things that happen for no reason at all, whether we deserve it or not, right? So something just happens randomly, right? I'm walking and a bird poops on my head, right? Mm-hmm. That's just random. Is there any meaning to that? Maybe I should carry an umbrella or something, or watch out for birds flying overhead. Right. I don't mean to make light of the things that happen, but
sure.
When we again approach it as if God chose for him to go or her to go at this time in this way, especially when it's something that is so clearly tragic, like a suicide or just a premature death. All deaths are premature, right? Even in old age, because they cut us off from eternal life. That's why, again, Christ came to remedy that situation and defeat death for us. But when we do that, again, it hurts also the people going through it, because they now are angry at a God who could do this to them. How could you take my child away? Or how could you take my brother or my parent away? Or how could you let this happen, a rape? How could you let this person commit suicide?
Right. Because as you're saying, not that God made it happen, right? But you would say he does know it's going to happen.
Yes. And that takes us right into a scriptural reference that I think is important for us to talk about. It's in Romans 8. St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 8, verse 29. Actually, we'll start at verse 28. We know that in everything God works for good, with those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. So you'll hear the word predestined is here, and it's in Scripture, right? But it's crucial what comes before that, foreknew, foreknowledge. Just as a point of reference, for more on kind of Orthodox perspective on predestination, which touches upon this verse, I'd strongly recommend listening to a podcast done by the late Father Thomas Hopko, of blessed memory, who was the dean at one point of St. Vladimir Seminary. He talks about this. So if you Google Father Thomas Hopko, Hopko, predestination, you'll find it online on Ancient Faith Radio. But this idea of foreknowledge is really important. It comes before the word predestination, because of course God is omnipotent. He knows everything. So of course he knows how everything is going to play out. Yes. Time is all before him. So we know that he knows everything. But, as Father Thomas Hopko will say, he knows everything. So he knows, like, Reuben, you're gonna, tomorrow you're gonna decide to eat, a sandwich for lunch. He knows you're gonna do that. But it's not because you're predestined to do that. He knows you're gonna do it because he just knows how you're going to choose with your free will. Does that make sense?
Right.
So it's a hard thing to grasp at first for us to think of that way, because we're human beings and everything is linear, and it's like, well, all right, but how can he know it, but it's still my free choice?
Right, before it's happened.
Before it's happened,
Yeah.
yeah. But that's sort of the mystery of an omnipotent being that we can't comprehend because we're finite. We can't understand how that works. But if we truly believe that he gave us free will, because he is love, again, going back to 1 John, this is what we hold, right? That we are truly free. If not, then what he gave us, how he loves us, is not a perfect love. Because that's so important, because we know that cliched expression, if you love them, set them free, right? But in some sense, that's very accurate to how we understand how God interacts with us. He loves us so perfectly. They said, I'm not going to make you a robot, just a slave to me and my will, forcing you to love me and be one with me. And I give you that choice. I want to be in union with you. I want to be one with you, but I'm not going to force you to. It's up to you, because love forced is not love. It has to be freely given on both sides, right? So it all goes back to this. So this free will is a huge part of that. So he knows how we're going to choose with our free will. And then it says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. So because he knows how you're going to choose, he has a plan based around that, because he knows what's going to happen. Okay? But it doesn't take away our free will.
Is based on the free will.
Based on the free will,
right.
Yeah.
So I think I'm understanding it correctly. What happens in our lives, whether it's something we do or something that happens to us, on one hand, you could say there's an element of divine providence from God.
Yeah.
Where obviously he can control everything, and there are certain things that happen because God wills it so. But also, on the other hand, there's an element of our free will and the consequences of the actions that we choose.
Yeah.
And the people around us, the consequences of the actions they choose that might directly affect us. And all of that comes together is kind of what happens in our lives. That's
yeah. So
okay.
Exactly. So, God, another way of saying is, we can't necessarily always say God planned this, but he planned for it, right? So we find ourselves in a difficult situation. Let's say you experience abuse, like sexual abuse. God would never desire that. It's evil. What this does to people in their lives is horrible, right? So how could a loving God plan that? He didn't plan it, but he knows that it's going to happen as a result of people's choices and even random things that are outside of people's control sometimes, nature and natural things. But so because he knows that, then he has a plan to get us through it, or he has a plan to lead everything, all of creation, into his second coming, right? Into the kingdom. So he hasn't planned it, but he's planned for it. Right.
Because that would lead me, then based off of that, then going off into my next question is, he knows what's going to happen. And let's abuse or anything that happens, but even if it's death, right? Like you said, the terrible cases that we've had, especially in our own community, he knows those are going to happen and when they're going to happen and who it's going to happen to. Then I think that also brings up the question, then why wouldn't he stop it from happening?
And then we get into sort of the next logical step.
Right. If he knows it's going to happen, if that person didn't make the choice to, for that to happen, it's somebody else choosing it, then why doesn't God stop it from happening?
So before we tackle that question about how can God allow these things to happen, we should talk about what we mean when we say, or how to be careful and not say things like, this was meant to happen. So again, God doesn't desire for this evil to happen, like let's say a vicious murder or something like that, or rape.
But he plans for it.
So he knows that it's going to happen, and we'll get into the other thing later. Why is he allowed to happen? And the person didn't necessarily deserve it, and that's what's important too. And that takes back to they didn't deserve this. Colby and his daughter, or this girl Ruthie George, or this person that committed suicide. Of course not. And that's the reality of the broken world that we're in. It's an unjust, unfair world, and that's why Christ has come, right, to redeem it. So we shouldn't necessarily go to someone and say, like, oh, this is meant to happen. Like, he had to die this way for this reason or that reason, right? But even though this death shouldn't have, like this tragedy, we say we wish it didn't happen, right? So this person that committed suicide, for example, we never want that to happen, right? And it's an ultimate tragedy. But because it did happen, there is hope somehow. Even in the case of like a suicide or a death, we say that's an ultimate tragedy that the death has happened. But now what's the hopeful side of it? That of all places for this person's soul to be, they're now in God's hands completely, right? And so we could say that is what we have hope in. That's where the meaning comes, is because God can transform this evil into something good. Doesn't mean it never happened, right? It happened. But because now that it has happened, through a combination of choices, free will, natural disasters, random events based on the laws of the universe, whatever. Now that it has happened, God can bring something good out of it. We may not be able to understand what that is and see what that is now, but like I said, in the case of a death, what is the hope? What is the good, the beauty that can come out of that? That this person is in God's hands. Like for someone who committed suicide, they were in such despair and they suffered, right? And the church looks upon that very compassionately, right? Because we understand mental health plays a role in suicide,
Sure.
etc. So we don't condemn that person. They're in God's hands. They're in God's hands, right? So again, we don't say, well, that was meant to happen. It's for some greater cause, right? Because then people have this thought, again, what kind of God is this? That he would put someone through this, right? But because it has happened, God has planned for it, for the people that have experienced the loss of the person who has suffered, whatever it may be. So we have to remember that. So I tell, when I'm talking to people about this, not people who have, gone through a loss right then and there, but people that have gone through a loss, just be there, listen to them, comfort them. I would steer away from trying to explain too many things to people that are grieving and suffering, just listen. But
like you said, I mean, it's with that hope of what's after this life that we should always keep in mind.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, for our own youth today, right? I mean, I know plenty of people, even like late high school and in college, who have lost parents, who have lost siblings, right? Lost loved ones. I think you would agree, like in the moment, it's very hard for anyone, especially to think about, the kingdom after this, right? Because you're dealing with that
You're
loss
hurting.
in the present moment.
You're hurting. Yeah.
It hurts.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and that would be my, it's just that the only thing, like at the funerals of the people that committed suicide, all you can say is, this should never have happened. Like, it's a tragedy. We're not going to go and say that it was meant to happen and there's meaning in this evil, suffering, and tragedy. The meaning comes from how God transforms it into something else, just as he transforms death into life, right? So that's all I said, was just, we know that he's in God's hands, and that's the ultimate comfort, though, is that we wish this never would have happened, and we wish we'd go back and we could have seen the signs that this person was depressed or whatever it is, and could have gotten to this person. Now that it has happened, we can't despair. There is always hope, and that hope is God is there, right? And now this soul is in God's hands. So that's what's most important out of these situations, to remember and to remind people, just as, I'm so sorry, we're praying for you, we're with, God be with you, let us know if you need anything. If they ask questions, that's all I would answer, is just, it's so awful. Thank God that we believe that this person is in God's hands now. That's the hope, and we hope that we will be together again, etc. So that's just my strong urge, is just to not tell people, oh, what's part of the plan. It was meant to happen this way, etc., etc.
Right.
So like, you lost your parent, and that was supposed to be that way. No, right? God suffered with us, right? He came amongst us because of the human condition, right? To offer us life,
Right.
Because we died, right? We were separated, cut off from him completely. So,
I think that's a really beautiful way that the church teaches it. Like as you said in the beginning, that death is the ultimate tragedy for us as humans, right? The greatest result of sin in this world is death, right? But as the church views it, even death is a way for us to see the hope that Christ gave us. That even as the greatest result of sin, even after all of that happens to us, Christ is able to overcome that. Like you just said, Christ gave us life through his own death, actually,
Yes.
right?
By death, he's trampled down death. Yeah, we see
Right,
at the beginning
and-
of the Qurbana, right?
Exactly, and I think that's beautiful in a way that our church teaches it, is that this is not the end all be all. That the power of death can only do so much, right? And after that, Christ takes you the rest of the way, hope in our hope to the kingdom. And I think, like you said, it's hard in the moment for people to understand.
And that's okay.
To remember
Again,
that.
I
And
think
it's natural. It's
natural.
understandable.
And again, it's a natural reaction from people who are, loving and compassionate and want to be comforting to say like, oh, God has a plan, right? But I've found and been confirmed, with some people's, reactions recently that it's really not helpful, and it's not it's not really in line with what we believe as far as free will predestination, So again, the method, the mode of how it happened, we don't necessarily say, well, God did this, right? Again, we don't presume to know everything that he's doing and not doing. But we don't say he's doing this in the minutia, and he put the banana there that you slipped on and fell off the cliff because of, right? Yeah. But he knew that you were going to do something that would lead to your death at that moment. And so now he's in control of your soul. He's there for your family, right? The Holy Spirit, the Comforter, is there. So we have to pray and try to be there for them. But again, nothing we can do or say is going to stop the hurt, right? And so nothing I'm going to say in this podcast is going to, that makes me be able to deal with tragedy. No, this is a part of life, a part of the suffering, a part of the difficulty of living in this world is dealing with these horrible things. Even for somebody we don't know, like a Kobe Bryant, right? So many of us are so affected by that, even though we never knew him, right? Mm-hmm.
To us, with the exposure, he was just a big part of our life.
Yeah, a big part of it. So even that you feel it so intensely, it's just part of the human condition that is so tragic. And why I'm thankful that I have this faith that was shown to me by others, because otherwise, what hope would there be? It'd just be a world where there's so much suffering and death and injustice and people experiencing things that, again, they didn't deserve, like you pointed out. This little child died, or this person, again, was raped or murdered. They didn't deserve that, right? But thank God for God that there is hope beyond this broken, suffering, often evil existence. I don't know how I would personally deal with the losses that I've dealt with and the sufferings that happen every day if I didn't have some hope. And so for that, I'm so thankful. So that's what I think we have to remind our people, is that even in the worst of situations, not that you should, and this will go into one thing I want to cover from the book of James as well. Not that we're like, this is part of God's plan. We have to be happy that, this person is going through this horrible tragedy. But no, that we rejoice that there's hope in spite of it, right? Not to reduce it, but we know the expression, you make lemonade, life gives you lemons, you make lemonade out.
Right.
Lemons are still good, so I don't understand that expression. But we understand the point behind it, right? So that's essentially, in a very crude way, what we are hopeful for, that this unjust existence is here, and this death happens, this unnatural death, because of our imperfection, sinfulness, and brokenness. But in spite of that, it will be transformed into life, right? All of creation will be redeemed. This broken, unjust creation will be redeemed, and it will be the kingdom for all eternity. So, going back to what I said about James, there's another thing I want to point out from the Epistle of St. James. In the very first chapter, the second verse of James chapter 1 is, "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you meet various trials. When you meet various trials, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." So the key word here is when, not because of, right? So we're not saying, you got your leg cut off in a skiing accident or something like that, whatever it is. No, you should be happy, you should be thankful for that, right? No, we wish that didn't happen, right?
Right.
But when you fall into those things, then you say, now that it has happened, we can't go back. Now what can it produce, right? And St. James says the testing of your faith in various trials produces steadfast patience, for example, right? So something happens between you and a friend. We wish it didn't happen, right? Some sort of falling out. But now that it has happened, if you follow God's will for, now that this has happened, God's will to get you both through it, if you're open to it and follow it the best of your ability, it can lead to, maybe I became more aware of something that I did that was wrong, or I grew in my patience or my compassion for this person, or my ability to forgive someone or work through something, right? So the joy is not in what happened. The joy is in what can come out of it. The hope that is God always, that can come out of even the darkness times, the light can come and dispel the darkness.
Right. And then that also means when these things happen, it's important not to let it bring us down. Yeah. To the point where it takes away that.
Exactly. So yes, we're going to suffer, and pain is okay, and shedding tears, and that's, and that's good, especially in the case of you losing someone because you love them. So of course you're going to cry, and I don't want people to think that they shouldn't be sad and upset and frustrated and angry. That's a natural part of being a human being, and it shows that you care and you loved this person, or you're upset because of this unjust or evil situation. So don't ever try to hide it. Suffer, cry. You're not always going to be on cloud nine all the time. That's not reality. But like you said, never ever despair, never ever give up hope. And that's something that my older brother, God bless him, always reminded me when I was a kid, was don't ever lose hope, because that's not Christian, to completely lose hope, to completely despair. That's why we look at suicide, for example, as something so tragic, because it's ultimate despair. There's no hope at all. The only thing I can do is completely end my life. Right. In the old days, yes, the church wouldn't give a Christian funeral to someone who committed suicide. Right. And nowadays we do, not because the church has changed its position. We believe that suicide is wrong and tragic and shouldn't happen. But of course, we understand more about mental health and mental illness and depression, and how these things play a role into the actions that lead up to someone committing suicide, for example. Getting off topic a little bit, but the church understands it's a horrible thing, but we don't know what they were going through, right? So nowadays, you'll always see every suicide that I've ever encountered in the church was given a Christian funeral, because nowadays we understand more than perhaps the early church did in society at that time about mental health and how that takes this role. Yes, there's certainly possibility that someone joined a cult and they have a suicide pact, and that would be a different situation, but we're not judging them. That's up to God to judge, but in that case, maybe, who knows? But again, what the church would do in that situation, it's case by case, and I'm getting off track, but we always look at, again, the hope that's there. Even in the person that committed suicide, we don't know what they were going through. They must have experienced ultimate anguish and despair. They're in God's hands now. What better place than God's hands? Again, we wish it didn't happen, but now they're in God's hands.
Exactly.
Rejoice in that hope. That's all we have, is that hope.
And I think that's where it comes to, I guess, maybe bring it back to the beginning of this, when people ask these questions, right? I think it probably comes from a place of despair and hurt when they feel, when they're affected by these tragedies, right? And it's interesting, I mean, not that saying, like we said, it's very natural to see people's reactions to these things, right? But it's like we need somebody to answer for it. And a lot of times we're looking at God too. Yeah. Either, like, we don't want to blame him, but we need answers.
It's a natural, you're angry at something. You have to direct your anger somewhere. How could this happen?
Right. Because we're at that point, right?
And that leads into the question that you asked about earlier. Okay, well then, why does he allow it to happen, right? If he's not making it happen, predestining it, right, to happen in this way, why does he allow it to happen? And that gets into the nature of the existence of suffering and evil in the world and things like that. And it goes back again all the way to our definition of God that we talked about from 1 John. God is love. Surprisingly, right? We're talking about why does evil exist, and we go back to God is love. That free will is at the crux of everything. So for us to truly have free will, our decisions have to be free and have to be real, have to have a consequence. Now, I don't also want people to be confused and think that I'm saying that an unjust death is something that we deserve somehow. That's not it either. It's not like I made a choice and that led to me being sexually abused, or me being murdered brutally or getting in a car accident even, right? A lot of this stuff is just random. It's part of the natural universe that God created. It has its laws, and someone else's choice may have in some way affected something, but I didn't deserve it. I didn't make that choice, so I'm not guilty of it. But it happens anyway, right? Again, that's part of the frustrating unfairness of life. That though I didn't deserve it, or you may not have deserved it, or we didn't make a choice, but at the same time, yes, we have free will, and these free will, these choices based on our free will have to have a real consequence. So if I say, I'm going to pick up this phone and I'm going to hold it up and I'm going to drop it. If it doesn't drop, am I really free to make that choice? No, because it didn't actually drop, right? So the laws of physics have to be there, etc. So again, we say, why did God allow this to happen? Something I said earlier, which is, God is not, again, predetermining everything in our lives, so we don't have a choice. But we do believe he's interceding. We do believe he is working in the world. Of course, Christ came and walked among us. All of us have experiences, a lot of us have experiences of something that miraculously happened, right? I feel like I should have died in that situation. What happened, right? I'm at a stoplight and the light turned green, but I didn't go for whatever reason, and then someone ran the red light, right? So these things do happen. These
happens all the time.
Happens all the time, right? In fact, you could say the miracles are happening every second. Just the fact that there's a universe, there's existence, right? That's a miracle in itself. At the same time, we don't know how God's working in the world as well. We can't perceive that. Again, like I said, if God wasn't interceding and intervening in the world at all times, I don't think we would be around, obviously, right? So, when we say, why is he not preventing these things from happening? We don't know what he is preventing. He is preventing a lot of things, we just can't see it all the time. But certain things will be allowed for a time because he has created us with free will and wants us to truly be free. And that's, again, a difficult thing for us to completely swallow as well. And the answer, the question to that might be, well, is he really good if he can allow these things that are so evil to happen, even in spite of them, right? So that's a topic for another day, and I don't think I have the capability of really explaining that well. So I'll leave it for maybe someone who's wiser and more knowledgeable than I am. But my understanding and what helps me see the hope in God and things that are good is that I know that he's only allowing it for a time. He won't intercede, he won't intervene in creation in a way that takes away our free will. So some things are just going to happen, right? Natural disasters, people's free will that infringes on other people's free will and their lives, and random things that happen that just are horrible, right? Just how did this person pass away? The fog that led the helicopter to go down in California, right, with Kobe and his daughter and the others. It just happened, and it sucks. God allows these things for a time, but again, we know he's going to come again, and all things will be redeemed, and the kingdom will be everlasting. Right? So, he allows it for a time, but even in those cases, I know of so many times. Think about, I'm sure you have experience with loss, or you've known people that have,
Sure.
lost people close to them. I've experienced so many instances and seen in so many families. For example, it's not always the case, but when someone dies in a family, I feel like almost always there's a birth as well. I don't know if you've noticed that. It doesn't happen in all cases, but it's happened so often that you can't help but see that in spite of this suffering, God is there because he's there. He's comforting, right? And we can say that, yes, God knows how these things are happening, so he does plan for the good. I'm not going to put out of the realm of God's hands, right, that, of course, this child is born around the same time that this family is also saying goodbye to someone, right? And that comfort, that blessing that comes with a new life can sometimes get a family through such a horrible loss. For example, this is a small example of something that I feel like is a noticeable and important for people to realize that God's with you. He suffers with us. He's not okay that we suffer and we die and we go through these horrible things. So he's saying he's allowing it to happen, yes, for a time because of his love and granting us freedom, complete freedom. But he's still there. He's still there working. He's still there with us. We call the Holy Spirit the Comforter. I met someone who lost a child. This was several years ago. And I saw this person like the day after, or like the week after they had lost their child. It was like, I think Holy Week was right after, something like that. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it was so tragic. A little tiny kid. The peace that I felt from that woman was unbelievable. Like, I can imagine myself, I would have been an absolute wreck. I probably wouldn't have been at church. I probably would have just been trying to hide from everybody and just really angry. And, I was so amazed that she just had this peace about her. And I knew, the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, is with her. The prayers of so many people are with her. Her prayerfulness doesn't mean that she's not suffering. Of course she's suffering immensely, and I'm sure still is all these years later. But she had a peace, because I know that she'd never given up hope, that this wasn't the end of her relationship with this child. And who could give that peace but God? So God is there in spite of all of these things. It's up to us to search for him and know that he's there and try to listen to him and see that he is there in spite of our suffering that can kind of close us off sometimes from, and that's natural. Like I said, I can imagine myself. I'm a weak person. If I had to deal with something to that magnitude, I don't know how I'd react. I hope I would react the way that I'm telling people I hope they do.
Right.
Maybe I would just be so angry, but hopefully not. And that's why we keep studying and keep praying and keep hoping and keep trying to grow closer to Christ, so that when these times come, we're able to see the hope and see the good and stay with him and see him working in spite of all of these horrible things.
Definitely. And I think that's a great way to sort of encompass our whole understanding of, tragedy and death, that having the peace, having the hope that comes from God for us, doing our best not to forget that during these times, right? One other thing we can take away, I think, is also when we see these other tragedies that happen, I think it's a good reminder for us not to take anything for granted either.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
As you said before, thank God for God, and thank him for everything else you have in your life. Because a lot of times it can happen at any moment, at any second,
Any moment, yeah.
Right.
Death comes like a thief in the night, right?
Right.
No one knows the day nor the hour. So, again, hopefully I didn't say anything that made someone's, suffering or so some remembrance of an event worse, and I ask forgiveness if it has. Ask forgiveness if I said anything that's, out of line. But the reason I feel strongly about talking about this, and, again, I've brought up this discussion and this topic at retreats recently and different places, because I feel so strongly because it does have an impact on how people grieve and their relationship with God potentially, and which I've seen, like I said. So when people say things that it's, that it's just meant to happen and they were supposed to go this way, and who are we to question God? Yes, of course, who are we to question God? Like, yes, but in this context, it points to something that we don't believe, which is predestination, and that God is this evil puppet master making these horrible things happen. I think the one thing I want people to remember is an expression that helps me. God didn't necessarily plan it, the event or whatever it is, but he planned for it because he knows that it's going to happen. So he has a plan to get us through it, not to make it go away. It happened. But there is a plan to get us through it, to somehow get us closer to the kingdom in spite of this evil that has happened. Even death, right? Like we said. Even in death, he has transformed death into life. So when you're with someone who is grieving, who has lost, don't try to explain too much to them. I wouldn't give them a podcast like this necessarily.
Right.
And maybe eventually, and if they ask questions, but in the moment, just be there for them. Know that they're hurting. Pray for them. Praying for them and being there for them, and trying to offer them some hope that this is not the end. This is not the end. That's all I would ask people to do in these situations. Not say God has a plan. Yes, he does, but not in the way that maybe you're suggesting, or the way that they might think you mean it in the case of a loss. Or who are we to question God again? Those things affect people and how they grieve, and again, how they think of God. I know someone who seemed very angry because they kept hearing that. And like, well, who is God that would do this? So
Right.
something I feel very strongly about, because it's a world that traumatizes all of us. We all go through it.
Mm-hmm.
And every day there's something that happens, right? And whether it's this recent tragedy in the news or whatever it is. So we have to be strong and have to know what we believe and what we hope in so that we can get through it together.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Like I said, this is a very important topic that affects us, not just, while we're in college, for the rest of our lives. Our whole lives we're dealing with this. So thank you, Shamashin, for taking this much time to talk with us about it today. For anybody out there with questions, I highly encourage you, when you're dealing with these things, to, if you have a spiritual father, definitely reach out to them.
Absolutely.
But thank you, Shamashin, again, for taking time to talk with us. And for those of you listening, just stay tuned for another episode of Chaiyya Chats.